Hi everyone, in this video we're gonna do a deep dive into the strengths and weaknesses of the Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, the last Christopher Nolan's movie. As always, I encourage you to watch it and draw your own conclusions. That is very important. However, the goal of this video is to learn about filmmaking, to understand what works, what doesn't, and above all to give you my professional perspective by analyzing cinematic language, just like we would in a classroom. So let's try to set aside any biases and look closely at this film to learn how to become better writers and directors. So the first aspect to take into account is the script. Before diving into the script, I want to mention that I have watched this movie several times. I didn't do this just to speak with authority, but because there is a lot of buzz online claiming this film is incredible, and this isn't from people I know personally, but from internet community. So I wanted to investigate and see if I was making a mistake in my analysis or misreading the cinematic language of the story. But as it turns out, every time I rewatch it, I just uncover more flaws. Generally speaking, when a movie fails to convince us, move us, or just feels off, that weakness almost always stems from the script and the story. One of the most glaring flaws I notice is how scattered the screenplay is. This often happens with adapted scripts. In this case, it's an adaptation of the Homer's Greek epic, but Nolan fails to realize two things. First, that literature doesn't always translate directly into a screenplay. And second, if you want to adapt it, you must make the necessary structural changes to do so successfully. For example, looking at this chart, here on the board you can see the general structure of film, where you can see the first act, second act, and the third act, and two main plot points. That is a structure that every single film you have been watching until today has followed. But pay attention, I'm not saying that every film follows it perfectly, but they all try to adhere to it because of Robert McKee's structure, which is still used today. And the most successful films respect it completely. Then this structure consists of the three-act journey that typically centers around a character with a clear objective throughout the story. For example, Gladiator's goal is to redeem his family, and he achieves it in the end. But throughout the journey, the character is consistent. His objective is emotionally defined. We could say the same about Interstellar, which is one of the Nolan's best films. The objective is clear: to save the world, and they succeed. But in The Odyssey, although one could say that the objective is achieved in the end because Odysseus manages to return, Homer's idea wasn't to highlight this objective, but rather the interesting nature of the journey and everything Odysseus experiences internally during it. And that is the reason why in literature you can follow several structures. It's not mandatory that you follow this classical archetype. I mean, in literature, you can have several objectives throughout the story. You can have several main characters. You don't need one single protagonist. And you can actually change the character's objectives throughout the story. However, Nolan's film lacks two key elements. At first, we believe Odysseus' goal is to return to Ithaca. But as the story progresses, in conversations, we enter a world of frustrations where his objective seems to dissolve because literature works under different conditions, under different rules, because the reader has the chance to activate their imagination while reading, and that is crucial when it comes to differentiate literature from cinema. On top of that, there is an overload of secondary characters that weakens the story's progression. For example, take Telemachus, for instance, a character I find to be one of the weakest in the story. He is given a prominent role right from the start, which completely distracts from the Odysseus journey. Not to mention that visually he is an adult, not a child, yet he is forcefully infantilized just to justify helplessness in solving problems, and especially when facing conflict. But pay attention, I'm not saying that this character should be eliminated from the story, but rather that his construction should be explored further to adapt him to film. Now, the most serious issue I see in the script is Nolan's obsessive need to explain everything through dialogue. In a movie like Interstellar or Oppenheimer, this can be an interesting tool because we're dealing with science, you know? But here, in trying to portray Homer's epic tale, it becomes heavy and tedious. It disconnects us from the character's emotion and honestly is just very uncinematic. So those are the most notable flaws I find in the script. Scattered objectives and excess of irrelevant characters, over-explanatory dialogue, and above all, a very weak dramatic arc. Honestly, the Odyssey itself might not strictly require a dramatic arc, but someone needs to have a strong one to justify the weight and persistence of the journey. I explained this in more detail in this another video right here, where I break down the difference between the protagonist and the main character. You can check it out anytime. But now let's jump to the next aspect: production design and art direction. This topic connects back to what I had discussed in another video where I explain how inflation has impacted Hollywood over recent years. However, I still don't think that is an excuse nowadays. We are talking about a $250 million budget here, and I have seen productions with a fraction of those resources achieve extraordinary quality. In fact, you can sense a minimalist intent in this film, likely because Nolan didn't have access to all the resources he wanted. Again, it's not that 250 million isn't a lot of money, it's just that it doesn't go as far in Hollywood today as it did 20 years ago. So what are the obvious blunders? Low quality armor, for example, that look like plastic or rubber. This is glaringly obvious throughout the film. And I'm not talking about Agamemnon's armor, I'm talking about the Trojan's armor. I don't know where the idea came from to make this armor that looks so cheap. And on top of that, the costumes are uninspired and the color combinations are off. For example, this kid right here has one of the worst costumes. It looks completely synthetic, made of cheap materials. Personally, I find that unacceptable. All of these elements are the signifiers used to tell the story. It's not just about cinematography or sound direction. This is absolutely critical. Art direction. Not to mention the poor choice on locations and the underwhelming reconstruction of Troy itself, which completely fails to capture the grandeur and historical weight those walls hold in the Greek lore. Now let's talk about sound and music. The sound design feels adequate and proper. It didn't slow me away, but it gets the job done. What really left me unsatisfied was the soundtrack. It severely lacks a powerful leitmotif for the film, a musical theme that captures the essence of the entire story. In almost all the Nolan's films, the music features a melody that stays with you forever. That is incredibly powerful, but unfortunately, even though there are melodies here, for example, the fact that the sound of the bow blends with the soundtrack, perfectly transforming it into diegetic music is something original, but I feel that apart from that, there is no emotionally important melody. Not a single one is memorable enough to stick with us or tap into the deep emotions of the story. Now let's go with the cinematography. Granted, there are shots that I would call memorable. The horse stranded on the beach, which is a fantastic shot, or this other one, showing the ship journeying towards the sirens, for example. Overall, it's very beautiful. It could win an Oscar, in fact, but I would have liked it to have more consistency. That is, for all the images in the film to be at the same level. That is very important. Don't get me wrong, it's beautiful, but what I mean is, cinematography must be consistent throughout a film. Look at Joker, for example. Every single frame is flawless. Look at Parasite, for example. Every shot is meticulously crafted. Even if you look at standard period pieces, Gladiator or Troy, they maintain excellent cinematography from start to finish. This is a crucial element when building a narrative. Now let's talk about performances. As far as the acting goes, almost every flaw I find ties back to the script rather than the talent of the lead actor. In other words, if the actors are given weak, inconsistent dialogue or forced into unjustified actions, that is a failure of writing, not acting ability. However, where I do see major shortcomings is in the background extras and some of the minor supporting actors. This is a classic issue in mega-budget blockbusters. It becomes completely obvious during the scene with the giants in the forest, where Odysseus' soldiers are fleeing and their facial expressions look incredibly weak and poorly acted. The mind-boggling part is that these people went through an audition process, a massive one, just to be there. In cinema, background extras are just as vital as the lead and supporting cast. We can compare this to a painting. It's not enough for just the main subjects to be beautifully painted. The figures in the background must be excellent too. No matter how many there are, you can clearly see it in this painting. This is the fundamental figure ground principle applied to art. So to conclude, the director's intent is good. Personally, I do find that the film has valuable and interesting moments that showcase the Nolan's talent in bringing them to life. So I would say this is not Nolan's best film. It feels more like an experimental exercise where he mixed a lot of different moments, played around with them, and in the end had to piece that experiment together and present it to us. It's a movie that reveals many of the challenges that Hollywood and the film industry are currently facing. And it also shows us the massive power of marketing, which can convince us to go to the theater even when a film doesn't fully deliver on what was previously promised. So if you liked this video, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Sending you a big hug, and see you next time.